I'm a great advocate of new approaches to reading the Bible. And when we do this, it doesn't mean that the Bible will necessarily make us comfortable in our presuppositions. One thing I have always been impressed with about Americans, they love to be comfortable. We don't mind roughing it a bit in Australia, at least in comparison with the Americans. But you Americans just about make a religion out of being comfortable, and I think that includes religion too. Comfortable ecclesiastical pews and beds. I somehow think we tend to choose a church like Goldilocks chooses a place to eat and sleep. You know how Goldilocks came into the house of the three bears. She tried Daddy Bear's chair, and it was too big. And Mommy Bear's chair, no, that was also too big. And she tried Baby Bear's chair, and it was just right. And then Goldilocks wants a place to lay down her head. She's very tired. And she looks for a nice place to sleep. And she gets into the bed of the Reformed Presbyterian Church, and it is too hard. And maybe she tries the bed of the Episcopalian Church, but it is too soft. And she gets into the bed of the Baptist Church, and she says, I can't stand a waterbed. And then she tries another of some sort of primitive church. It's too rigid. And another, that's too unstable. And finally, Goldilocks, she finds the bed of the Church of the Happy Attitudes, and it is just right. And Goldilocks goes sound asleep. Now, isn't that what we like? But I have to be frank that as we take up the theme of the Spirit of Jesus, it's not going to be a lullaby to put Goldilocks to sleep. You have heard of the well-known Christian song. It embodies a lovely sentiment. Be like Jesus, this my song, in the home and in the throng. Isn't it funny how whether a person is a Baptist or a Lutheran or a Mennonite or a Pentecostal or an Adventist, they all interpret it their own way in their own setting. It's a bit like, the irony of it is somewhat as if we were members of a pacifist society. Just think now, we imagine we're all good pacifists. Non-resistance. Our aim is to be meek, mild, very gentle. We'd never think of punching anyone on the nose. And someone gets up and gives us an exhortation. Here's my theme today, be like Rambo. Now, some of you may be so spiritual you don't know what Rambo was like, but I think probably most of you do. Be like Rambo. And you all listen, and then to close with we'll have a song, and you all sing, be like Rambo, this my song, in the home and in the throng. And having heard the dissertation and sung the theme song to be like Rambo, you all go out and you are better members of the pacifist society than you've ever been. More loyal, more gentle, more submissive than you have ever been. Now, I'm going to level with you. Being like Jesus won't make you a better Lutheran and a better Baptist, or a better this or a better that, of what whatever religious system within the Christian spectrum you may happen to be. And in order to get you all into this net, include everyone here, I'm going to be scandalous enough to suggest that being like Jesus will make you a bad Christian. A scandal. An embarrassment to whatever religious niche you may find yourself in the spectrum of Christianity. In order to come to the grips with this theme, be like Jesus, we need to ask ourselves, of course, what was Jesus like? And it is clear, as one author said in a recent book, it is clear that Jesus said and did so many things unlike what Christianity came to be. What was Jesus like means we need to be sensitive to the Spirit of Jesus. The Spirit manifested in his teachings, in his works, in his life. In order to do this successfully, we need to read the Bible in a new way. Perhaps in a way that we Westerners are not used to reading the Bible. That's why I said we have to do something to get ourselves out of our old rut. Like, if necessary, hanging upside down and reading the Bible. At least it would get a bit of blood to the head. But somehow in our Western tradition, when we read the Bible, we are so much hung up on and orientated to the idea the essential thing we need is information, especially accurate information. Our concentration is on letter rather than spirit. We come to the gospel accounts rather than reading that we may be impacted by the Spirit that breathes through the Gospels. We tend to come looking for information. This applies to many aspects of the Bible, of course. I could use all sorts of illustrations. Take the book of Daniel. Now, most people who get into the book of Daniel get into the thing of interpretation. What does the four parts of the metal mean? What does the four beasts mean? And they think that this sort of interpretation, this esoteric information, is the secret of understanding the book of Daniel, and it is 90 miles away from it. The main thing in the book of Daniel, it really, I'm going to suggest, it doesn't matter who the four kingdoms are. It doesn't hardly matter that much. Some can give you a list of four and there's all different ones. And people can argue forever and a which is the correct four here. There's not only one interpretation. It doesn't really matter. That's not the message. That's not the Spirit that breathes through the book of Daniel. The same with the book of Revelation. It is not to interpret the exact meaning of the seven heads. It doesn't really matter. Much of the book is in song. It is a liturgy. It is to be moved by the spirit of it. It is to be caught up. It is to be sensitive to the mood. It is said that Beethoven would not be upset if someone in rendering one of his compositions made a few technical mistakes. But if someone misinterpreted the whole mood of his composition, he would become angry. When we read the Gospels, answering the question, what was Jesus really like? It is far more important to be infected with the Spirit of Jesus than to be informed about all manner of detail in the story of Jesus. And I'm more anxious, as we fellowship here together, I am far more anxious to infect you than I am to inform you, because you will forget most of what I say. There's no question about that. You may even forget all what I say, and it probably won't really matter. But if I can succeed in infecting you with the spirit that I am anxious to infect you with, you'll have a disease that you'll never shake off. Now, we need to be sensitive to the fact that the Spirit is far bigger than the letter. The letter can never be adequate enough. The letter is never adequate to contain Spirit. Spirit is much, much bigger than letter. It overflows. It can't be confined to mere grammatical expressions, to propositions, to ideas, to information, and so on. What we're dealing with is something infinitely grander than that. And one of the most tragic things in reading the Bible is to reduce it to a package of mere ideas and information. We can have all the information in the world, but if we are not impacted and infected by the spirit of it and caught up in it, we have lost everything. Let me give an illustration to demonstrate how spirit is much bigger than letter. Supposing someone came excitedly to you and said, I have discovered something really big, unbelievably big, unimaginably big, indescribably big. I have discovered something big. And you said, can you describe it to me accurately and adequately? And if he said yes, what would you say? If you had any brains at all, what would you say? Well, it's not as big as you said it is. It's not very big then. Now, the New Testament witnesses testified to us that they have encountered something really big. How big? Well, one witness says it is so big that all the books of the world would not do it justice, is not adequate to convey how big it is. The Apostle Paul in one place says it is so big it passes knowledge. In another place he said you cannot really articulate it. Only the Spirit can really reveal the reality of it to you. It is so big, he says, well, for us, in this life, at best, we can only see it through an opaque glass, dimly. Why then do we insist that the letter and the information in the New Testament is as big as the Spirit, or as if it is something which adequately or even accurately conveys the dimension, the reality of the Spirit of Jesus? Paul said it well in one place when he said, we bear this treasure in what? You know it. In earthen vessels. We, he includes himself. He must include his letter because he said that in one of his letters, which we call Holy Scripture. We bear this treasure in earthen vessels, or we bear this great treasure in clay jars. Think of it. Clay jars. And Luther says the New Testament documents are like the swaddling clothes which contain the Christ. Let's imagine these clay jars have been unearthed. Clay jars, you remember, mere clay jars from the 1st century Palestinian or Mediterranean world, and archaeologists have discovered these old clay jars. And as one archaeologist or one scientist, we live in a day of investigation, the scientist puts the clay jar under close investigation of the microscope and so on, and he says, hey, he says to one of his colleagues, I think I've discovered something. Do you see that hairline fracture in that jar? Why, that's going to be a shock, isn't it, to some people? In another one, as they examine it, says, yes, I think you're right. But if you look closely, there's more than one hairline fracture. There actually is several of them. And then an expert comes in pottery. And he says, really, if you examine the formation of this old clay jar, you will see that they even made it with quite a faulty, compared with our modern technique and superior technique, these old clay jars really portray a faulty pottery-making technique. Now, among the faithful who regard these jars as the holy relics of the church, there's a terrible kerfuffle. They throw their hands up in the air and they say, blasphemy! These are holy jars! This could not possibly be! God himself, the Almighty, presided over the formation, the construction of these jars. Most, of course, refuse to look. They accept on religious authority that the jars are as their religious authority instructs them to be. They wouldn't even dare to look. Religion can be a great blinding force, like the people in the Middle Ages used to argue about how many teeth a horse had, according to Aristotle, and no one was irreverent enough to look in the horse's mouth and count. Sometimes we're not much different. Why, when they were trying to prove whether Copernicus was correct or not, that the earth really goes around the sun, which was considered, of course, a subversive to religious authority, men started getting their telescopes out, looking for themselves, looking at the evidence. And one priest preached a famous sermon against such scientific examination, and he used the text, "Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven?" But however, the faithful, they have some scholars among them who will look at the jars and give them the real report. And so they put on their pious glasses, the holy glasses, to look at the holy relics. And they say, no, these jars, they are not hairline cracks at all. You see, that's a part, the scientists have really been deceived. They are really part of that amazing original design. There's absolutely no fault in the jars whatsoever. And as for the swaddling clothes, when they are examined, these old garments, one scientist discovers a faulting in the stitch, or how that a mistake was made here, and the weaver, they says, isn't it interesting how they wove garments in those days? You see how the garment was being made, and somehow there was a faulty stitch here, so they brought the thread and so on back this way, and they look at the garments, and again the faithful throw their hands in the air about this terrible blasphemy. Why, these garments are made in the loom of heaven. It's impossible that in them there could be even one thread of an imperfect design. But you see, I think you know the force of the illustration. That sort of reaction does not enhance the treasure. In fact, often in all the debate about biblical documents, the spirit is lost and the treasure is lost sight of. And to insist that these clay jars, this testimony of early Christians, because that's what the New Testament is, it is the early church's witness to the Christ, to insist that in every way, and in every respect, this describes the reality accurately and adequately, is a terrible cutting down of the treasure to a mere finite level that we can contain to get God in a box. Because how can the finite do justice to and contain the infinite? And so as we read the Bible, as we approach it, as we learn to read it with a new approach, to be impacted and to be caught up in the real spirit of it, to be infected by the spirit of the Christ, who is their witness to, we must be very sensitive to the fact that the Spirit is far greater, infinitely greater, than the mere letter. For when we look at the evidence of the New Testament, the documents themselves, those clay jars, those swaddling clothes, there is evidence that the New Testament church, in some respects, failed to fully grasp the aims and the intent of Jesus, that in some respects they failed to carry through with his breathtaking radical freedom. For even in the most primitive church, the one that was first formed at Jerusalem, led by James and Peter and John, there's a wide recognition today that there was a retreating from the radical freedom of Jesus to a kind of Jewish cultic conservatism. There is evidence of a beginning of a world withdrawing asceticism, which of course accelerates with the passing of the first and the second and the third generation. And when you take up the documents of the church, 60, 70, 80, 100 years after Christ, very early writings and very representative. Documents like the teaching of the 12 apostles, the Shepherd of Hermas, the letters of Ignatius, the correspondence or the articles of Justin Martyr and others. There breathed through these documents of early Christianity a terrible, morbid, dull, grey or colourless asceticism. A sort of a world-denying, anti-life attitude. I have the whole library of the pre-Nicene Fathers in my library. To read those books, what was really the attitude of the greatest thinkers of the Christian movement, the fathers of the church, is a tremendous shock. For instance, I just mentioned briefly one whole area, a very important area, of course, in human life. The attitude to women is appalling. Not by a few radical or fringe lunatics of the church, but I mean the mainstream, its major expression. For hundreds of years, the greatest thinkers of the church could hardly say a good thing about a woman. It's appalling. As far as they could say about the best thing that seems to come through is that the woman is the devil's temptress. The more dowdy you can make her look and keep her out of your sight, the safer you will be. And as for the book Song of Solomon, the only way that they could justify its existence, of course, in the Bible was to give ridiculous allegorical interpretations of the book of Solomon as somehow being a great exposition of the glory of Christ. And in fact, the Christian movement went on for centuries and centuries, and there was never one commentary in Christianity that took the book Song of Solomon at its face value, namely a celebration of sensual, physical love between a man and a woman. Not a one took it at its face value. That's how anti-life they were. And of course that feeling has prevailed way down even to modern times in the treatment of the book Songs of Solomon. I remember one fella in Australia who's very devotional, oh, he used to read the Bible and from beginning to end, and this was his devotion, and of course he'd try and read it all, and he said, oh, somehow, he said, I have problems with the Song of Solomon. He was looking there for some great mystical truth of his, to elevate his devotion to Christ. He said, I can only get into about the 2nd chapter, he said, and then the devil takes over. Now, there's something ascetical about Christianity, and it goes right back, a sort of a world-denying, a dullness, a greyness that is so antithetical to the Spirit of Jesus. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, one of the greatest opponents of Christianity thought it was a disaster. He saw it as a sort of a gloomy miasma sweeping through civilization. And seeing that his resistance to it was being overcome and that Christianity was winning the day and was overtaking the whole Roman Empire, he made the famous statement, "O pale Galilean, you have conquered." Where did this idea of this pale Galilean come from? Well, you can say it all came from the falling away in the church and the ones that followed on from the New Testament era. There's a lot of truth in that, but it's not the whole picture. The roots of it will go right back, and you can even find traces of it right there in the New Testament documents themselves. There's one illustration how the finite, the clay jars, cannot be expected to do justice to the bigness of the gift. When we admit the human frailty of the documents that bore witness to our Lord Jesus Christ, we do not tarnish the honour of Christ, but it really becomes a means that opens the door to us to realise that maybe we have not done justice to the greatness, to the breathtaking reality of the Spirit of Jesus Christ that might set really Christians free from terrible, distorting, imprisoning misunderstandings. Yes, the New Testament documents, as well as the Old, of course. What's their function? They are necessary. They are very important. They are the first witnesses to Jesus. They bear witness to the heavenly treasure. But because the one they bear witness to is greater than, infinitely greater than, the witnesses. The Spirit that breathes through the New Testament documents is bigger than any one document. It is bigger than all of them put together. And because that is so, therefore the Spirit of Jesus in His gospel must stand over the New Testament documents. And we must interpret the New Testament documents in the light of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And we must even, I dare to say it, we must even bring those documents under the judgment and, if necessary, the correction of that which they themselves witness to. Really, that should not surprise us, although many will be surprised or shrink back from such a proposition. But when you think of it historically, that's what early Christians did. They judged the books of the Bible that are now in the New Testament. They judged them by the gospel. If they did not do that, how then did they make a decision what books they would include in the New Testament and what ones they would leave out? Or did the New Testament come out of heaven on a parachute? Did the angel Gabriel come down and tap some early Christians on the shoulder and says, hey, as they were making up the canon, you see, and says, hey, silly, put Matthew in. Hey, you, leave Barnabas out. Was there any word from heaven like that? No. Who decided what books would be included in the New Testament? Who decided which ones would be representative and which ones they would leave out? Because the fact is, some got left out just by the skin of their teeth. And some got in by the skin of their teeth. And for that matter, not all Christians in the world have 27 books in their New Testament. Western Christianity had 27 books. Eastern Christianity had more or less, I forget the number. The Ethiopians, they had their own canon. North Africa had theirs. And different places of the world, even today. Do you know that the Christian community doesn't all have the same canon? Some have more books, some have less books. It's not as cut and dried as we think. But even we Western Christians, who generally consent to having 27 books in our New Testament, that decision was not made by some arbitrary act from heaven. Christ didn't say what books to put in. The Apostles' book didn't tell us which books to include. It was the church itself, the community of Christians, just like ourselves. Over a number of years, they came to accept certain documents as representative and other documents as not representative. At least they wouldn't have them as the official canon of the community. So how did they make the decision? They themselves sat in judgment. And if you think it's terrible that somehow the New Testament documents must be brought under the judgment of the gospel and the Spirit of Christ, well, that's exactly what the early church had to do. Didn't Paul say? He himself say? Even if I, Paul, or the angel from heaven, brings you any other message, any other gospel, any other writing, anything that's not in harmony with the gospel that you have received, well, let him be accursed. So Paul invites, even commands, exhorts the community to bring everything under the judgment of the gospel, even his own epistles, his own writings, his own communication. Therefore, when we come to the Bible, let us see it as a witness. A witness given in mere clay jars to the Christ, to the Spirit of Jesus. When we read, let us recognize the Spirit is far bigger than the letter. And also to be sensitive to the Spirit that breathes through those documents. That the most important thing is to be impacted by and infected by the Spirit of Christ, rather seeking for mere information and ideas, so that all things in our life, everything, will now come under the judgment of the Spirit of Jesus.